Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is a hot topic. What happens now after the Article 50 has been triggered and the negotiations begin over Brexit? This time last year, Brexit was but a twinkle in the eye of some of our panelists. Both Jim Mellon and Howard Shaw here at Milken actually predicted that there would be a vote for Brexit, so they were different to most of the pundits. And since then, obviously, we have seen the domino effect of Brexit with Trump winning and us in the media, the lying media, all perceiving that there is a trend here. Two data points make a trend, and that maybe there's lots more populist movements that are going to sweep aside the conventional wisdom of the establishment, and the world will look a very different place in a few years' time. To discuss that, and we're not going to go, hopefully, through the Brexit debate itself again. We want to try and predict how things are going to turn out, both between Britain and Brussels and Europe, and maybe the broader populist story as well, if we want to get into that narrative. But to discuss that, we have on the far end Mark Blyth, the Economist at Brown, Nick Candy, who's a great real estate man from London, Jim, who I've already mentioned, Janet Thomas from Women Investment Banking, and Howard. And before we start, I'm going to ask each of them to give as close as they can manage to a one-word answer to 4 questions. And I might also survey you in the audience just to see where you're coming from as well, just so we kind of know roughly, before I get into their detailed predictions, where they might sit in the broad spectrum of opinion on what Britain ought to be doing. So the first question to each of you, were you a Brexiter or a Remainer, Howard?
Brexiter. Brexiter.
Brexiter.
Remainer.
Brexiteer.
Brexiter.
Remainer.
Remainer. And just to show I'm impartial, I was a Remainer as the moderator, but I will.
I might be a Brigetta.
I'll be a regatta.
Secondly, French election, Le Pen or Macron?
Le Pen.
Wow. Oh. If there's no terrorist attack before the weekend, Macron.
Macron.
Macron, but I don't think his majority will be as large as we're expecting.
Macron.
Okay, Theresa May, 100-seat majority or less?
Yeah, she'll get it.
Yes, I think she'll get it.
87.
It will be less than 100.
Less than 100? I could be less than 80.
German election, will Angela Merkel still be in charge by the end of the year?
Yes, unfortunately.
Yes.
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 And lastly, will there still be a euro in 5 years' time?
No.
There will need to be some reform in some shape or form.
No, there won't be.
Yes.
Highly probable. 2 words, sorry.
Sorry. Just to see where you're coming from in the audience, who would have voted for Brexit in the audience? And who would have voted to remain? So had this been Britain, we would not be talking about Brexit today. But anyway, so I want to start by looking at the negotiations. And it seems like already Britain and Brussels are establishing the most extreme positions they could do. We've had Mrs. Merkel talking about needing to Britain to realise it has a number of illusions about what might happen, and a very crisp and to the point position from all the 27 remaining nations in the EU that they're going to take a very hardball approach. They won't even talk about the future relationship with Britain until the existing arrangements, the divorce settlement has been done. And likewise, Mrs. May saying that she's going to be extremely difficult and rather no deal than a bad deal. So Howard, how does it play out from here? Is it going to, how long is those entrenched positions going to stay in place?
Well, I think the first point to make is that I think the real negotiation will be between the British government and primarily the German government, and to a lesser extent the French government. So They will control the process ultimately, not the bureaucrats in Brussels who have a vested interest in the perpetuity of their own organisation, trying to make it larger and have bigger salaries, etc., etc. So I can't see anything happening before the German elections. Angela Merkel's 100% focus at the moment is on trying to remain in power. I think I said earlier that I think she'll squeak home. And then there'll be a barter. And the reality is that they can say what they like, but it's about money. And ultimately, Britain's got two financial levers. One is that, as you say, there's a divorce settlement. And of course, we're not going to agree to pay anything before other aspects have been negotiated. So Britain will, in my view, and I've said this consistently, pay in on an annual basis, continue to pay into the EU, a lesser amount of money on a net basis than they were previously, but an amount every year as part of a divorce settlement for a period of time, perhaps not forever. But that check, which the Germans would otherwise predominantly have to pick up, is very much part of the deal. And a card that's a really important card that we need to play as part of
Currently, they want 50 billion.
Well, that's a nonsense, isn't it? I mean, the 50, 60 billion is a fictitious number invented by Brussels bureaucrats. It's a big chunk of it is the future pension fund liability, today's value of the future pension fund liability for their beautiful, wonderful pensions that they receive which are index linked forever and gold plated. So the second point to make is that we are not, as a nation, likely to accept a trade deal whereby the Germans, who have an export surplus of 50 billion a year approximately, are allowed to continue to sell their goods freely with a tariff, which is not that material, and the tariff can be outweighed by an exchange rate movement in a day. So you're not going to do a deal where you say, okay, you guys can continue to trade and sell your goods freely, but we're going to prohibit access to what you do, which is services. That's not equivalent. One is a block on trade, and another is a pricing issue. So the cards that we have to pay are, frankly, if you block our services and block access for financial services or pharmaceuticals, we're going to block access for you. And the most powerful lobby in Germany is the Mittelstand, who are predominantly exporters, and they're going to say, come on, let's come to our senses and do a deal. So the two financial aspects are going to be the most important elements for a deal. The third aspect that's being sort of bandied around is the security point. I think that's a weaker point because Britain's going to want to keep security within Europe alongside European partners, and they're going to cooperate come what may. To me, it's all about money, and the answer to your question is the deal will be done at the last minute. The history of the EU is always that they do it at 4 o'clock in the morning, on the last day, they patch together a deal, and it's not even a permanent deal, it's a temporary deal, which is a move towards another deal, because that's the way Europeans work. So at the end of 2 years, we'll have a patchwork deal, and then there'll be a continued negotiation. That's my prediction.
And I mean, if you're right that nothing really happens until the German election is done,
Yes.
and maybe this is just a year of getting some elections out of the way,
Yeah.
free everyone up to say what they really think.
Yeah.
There's then, what, an 8-month period, because most people think it has to be October next year that a deal is done so it can be ratified by the European Parliament and by the British Parliament and so forth. I mean, is 8 months something that you think is plausible? Or do you think actually the last minute means 2019, 2020, 2021?
See, the Europeans think differently. They change the rules. They'll fix the rules. They'll say, well, actually, you've got another 4 months. You don't have to ratify it within that period. As long as you do the deal by the date, we can ratify it later, or whatever. They always come up with a fix when their back's to the wall. The Europeans have to believe that Britain means business. And that's why I think Theresa May's adopting the right attitude, which is, you know what? You need us as much as we need you. It's in our mutual interest to do something which broadly speaking, maintains the status quo from a trading point of view. And
So you think it'll be a soft Brexit, essentially?
I don't believe in the word soft and hard. This is a media invention. It's just a deal. And the deal will be continued access in some form, continued payments in some form, taking back control over our immigration, regaining sovereignty. But in all cases, it won't be black or white. There'll always be some room for grey, and it's just a deal.
Janet, what do you think? You convinced?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that I do believe that there's a definition between hard and soft Brexit. And I think that we do have to look at the extreme ends of the spectrum because they are possible. Like I said earlier, I'm for Remain, so I have concerns about the tone of the negotiations at present. However, I do agree with you that this is all about finance. And from my perspective, as someone who's involved in the financial sector, I see three areas that are close to me where I think considerable damage can be done to the UK. But I think that one needs to really know what the true numbers are. And so here are the three areas that I think are of incredible concern to myself. The first is that the asset management industry is the second largest in the world. It's currently 2014 figures, or 2015 figures is that size the industry to be £5.7 trillion, of which in the UK, the asset management industry oversee the management of £1.2 trillion for European clients. In that industry, and also the clearing industry, we have about 100,000 people who look after the assets of clients not only in Europe and the UK, but globally. And we clear $850 billion of instruments every single day. Now, I do believe that the industry, that's going to be a key sticking point between the UK and the Eurozone. And this morning in the FT, I was concerned to see that what the Eurozone are going to do this coming June, they're going to publish some proposals to prevent the clearing industry from being hosted or retained in the UK. Now, if for whatever reason that activity has to move out of the UK into Europe, or part of it will probably go to the US, what we're looking at here is that you have about 100,000 people working in that industry just on the clearing side. And that will impact jobs in the UK, not only in London, but in areas such as Birmingham, Bournemouth, outside the M25. So I do feel that Britain's negotiating power, where it's financial, as a financial centre for Europe, is not, I think we have a weakness there. I don't believe that it's as strong, and I'm not as bullish as you are. I do agree with you, it does come down to numbers, but I'm not completely clear about what it is in number terms that the Germans are going to lose over our financial sector. And then the last area that we have, which is the area that I cover, is foreign exchange. The foreign exchange market is $5 trillion a day. It's hard to believe that 50% of global foreign exchange transaction is undertaken in the UK, and actually most of it in London. And that's quite extraordinary given the number of people actually working in that industry. The dollar covers 90% of all FX transactions, and the euro is 31%. Sterling is the fourth largest, most popular traded currency, and we only account for 13%. So again, you have a situation where we are responsible for exchanging foreign currency for the Eurozone in London. And I do see that for me, that's one of the first industries that I see that can be migrated to Europe. It will be an easy industry to move, and I feel that the EU will bring into place regulations which will make it almost impossible for us to retain that industry in the UK. And again, with foreign exchange, you have maybe 10,000 people in London working in that area. So I think when you start to add the figures up, you are actually looking at potentially over 100,000, maybe 150,000 jobs in the UK that could be relocated into Europe and maybe also to the US. So I'm not so confident that we have a strong negotiating position, and I do have concerns.
So Jim, I mean, which of these two views do you find most plausible? I mean, because I guess if you buy Janet's analysis,
neither.
You know,
although I'm ideologically inclined towards Howard's view, but I do understand that you have concerns, Janet, about the tone of the negotiation. But let's face it, the tone is coming out of Europe, the negative tone. They have been very combative, the 27 countries, and there was rounds of applause about how we're going to be united in our, our position vis-a-vis the United Kingdom. And although they claim that they want to be friends and so forth, the fact of the matter is that 27 of them have got to vote on whatever the deal is with the United Kingdom. I think we have the strong cards in the UK. I understand your concerns on the financial sector, but I disagree with some of what you said, because I think markets will take place wherever the markets end up being, and the Europeans can't stop us trading euros, and they can't stop us trading dollars, and they can't stop us trading Hong Kong dollars or whatever. We have the expertise, we have the reservoir of people in the UK who can do it, and the Europeans don't. So I'm not so concerned about the finance, but my position is as follows. Last year I said that I thought it would be better if the UK would remain in the European Union, but it was untenable given that the euro was the common currency, and the euro is the big fault line in Europe. And I'm absolutely certain that in the next 1, 2, 3 years, you will see first Greece leave the euro, and then secondly, Italy. And the political forces are aligning for that to happen. When that happens, Europe will be in financial chaos. And some of you will know about Target 2 imbalances. Some of you know about the fact that Italy has huge government debts, a lot of which are held by German banks and German institutions, and of course by the European Central Bank. The financial chaos that will come from that meant that I felt that we should be out of the European Union until such time as its financial problems were resolved and the euro broke up, and then a free trade Europe could be reformed in the shape of the original Europe that we joined in 1973. And I still think that is a possibility. But in the meantime, I do not believe that any negotiations with Brussels and the 27 will yield anything in the 2-year period other than acrimony and discontent. And I think that what we should do is say, we're not negotiating. We are not negotiating, but hey, we're a free trading nation. And if you impose tariffs on our goods, as they do, the European Union is not a free trade zone. It's highly protectionist to, for instance, US food imports or to cars from Japan, anything that threatens the vested interests of the people who are pulling the levers in Brussels. We are a free trading nation. We're not going to levy any tariffs on anything. We don't care if the Germans levy tariffs on our goods. We don't care if the French levy tariffs on our goods. We're going to be free trade. Furthermore, and this is where I differ from some of my colleagues on here, we are an open border country. We depend on immigration. We're going to let whoever wants to come into this country, subject to certain controls and so forth, but what we're not going to let them do is have welfare benefits for a period of, say, between 5 and 10 years. Because there are a lot of people coming into Britain at the moment from the European Union who are gaming the system and are getting welfare benefits, working the minimum 16 hours, and then getting a sort of triple top-up on their earnings. And that's a lot of those are EU citizens. And we're just going to stop that. So we let everyone in, we have free tariffs, we're open to the world, and we are a very successful trading nation. And the last point I'm going to make is that the amount that we've contributed to Europe since we joined, there has not been a single year since 1973 in which the British have not been a net contributor to the European budget, even though we were relatively poor when we went into the European Union in 1973. The net amount, after Mrs. Thatcher's rebate and so forth, is £320 billion. That's 3.5 years of the NHS, and it's also 633 million bottles of Jean-Claude Juncker's favorite wine, okay? It's not a trivial amount. We put a huge amount in. And for them to have the cheek to say, and by the way, on the way out of the club, and I've never heard of a club that actually charges you on the way out, you're going to pay us another £50 billion. Put that point, which they're very, convinced about, put that point to international arbitration and see what the result is. Allow some court of international arbitration to arbitrate on whatever that settlement might be. And it could well be that we get money back from them. We've got a large amount in various European banks for reconstruction and whatever, and we might end up with something back. I don't think negotiations are going to work. I think we should just say, right, we're not negotiating, we're not hiring 500 negotiators, we're not going to waste our time dealing with you, your herd of fish, and we're just going to basically be an open trade nation, open border nation, and if they want to play games with protectionism and immigration control and this and that, let them do it. It'll be to their detriment, not to ours.
Now, I take it you don't think that's going to be Theresa May's position?
Well, I hope... actually, I'm not sure about that. If I was her, I'd be pushed to the limit at the moment, given, you know, the leaking from Brussels about how the disastrous dinner took place, probably because there wasn't enough wine for Jean-Claude Juncker. But, you know, I don't know what she's going to do, but I would say that that would be a very good opening salvo. The Germans sell 850,000 cars a year in the United Kingdom. All right, we sell almost no cars in Germany. So, you know, is Volkswagen going to let this unresolved situation persist? I think it would be a very good prod up the you-know-what, pour encourager les autres, as the French say, and we might get a better result.
So, Nick, are you manning the barricades with...
I wouldn't go out for a drink with Jim and the Europeans. I think that's quite radical. I think if it was a businessman doing that decision, I think Jim could maybe adopt that. But we live in a political... Donald Trump would. Yes, Donald Trump would, and like his war, it wouldn't get built too quickly. Okay. So I think there will be negotiations, and I think the rhetoric about hard, soft, and Theresa May saying we're not going to negotiate and all that is very unhelpful. In any negotiation, both parties need to come to the table. And I think, you know, Theresa May can't leave it to the last minute. She will have this is all being that she'll win on June the 8th, which I think she will. But she can't leave it to the last minute. But what will happen throughout the negotiations is things in the European and the world climate will change. So in early 2018, we could see Italy out of Europe. And when that starts, it's a very different negotiation. Whatever we've agreed up to the beginning of 2018, you know, if Le Pen wins this weekend, which you believe she could, then it'd be a very different negotiation. We have to start the negotiation, which we shouldn't be going hard, soft. We shouldn't have super tough and like. Both parties don't need to be super tough. We both need to work with each other in the future. Okay, and so there has to be some give and take. And I think what will happen over the next 2 years is sometime in that there'll be another major country that has the equivalent of our Brexit, and that will affect the way the European Union deal with our Brexit.
I mean, if that happens, I mean, do you think the negotiations will just be put on ice?
No, they won't be put on ice. They'll continue to go, but there'll be major reform within the European Union. It has to. The European Union, as we know it today, doesn't work. In the last couple of days here at the Milken Conference, I've heard about, in America, what the people do like about, the businessmen do like about Donald Trump is the deregulation he wants to get done, and get done quite quickly. And a lot of people say that if he just does that, they'll be very happy for his term as presidency. And one of the issues we've got in the UK is we are surrounded by regulation from the European Union, and I think get some of those shackles off, and we're a brilliant country, and we'll continue to be a brilliant country, you know, with or without Europe.
And I mean, do you feel like when you say that people have to come to the table, do you think that Britain needs to accept that maybe this is a two-stage negotiation? You have to do the divorce settlement, then you do what happens after, or do you think?
Well, I think there'll be a divorce settlement. As Howard said, I think there'll be payments to be made for years to come. And it'll be both ways. There'll be an equation which, if you know they're importing stuff into us, there'll be a payment to be made.
And you don't accept Jim's view that this is like a preposterous club that is making you pay on the way out?
I think if it was a business, if we were running a business, Jim and I think we could run it that way. It's a political thing with too many politicians around it, and it's very high profile. It's probably the most high profile political thing going on in the world today.
Okay, Mark. So, what do you make of what you've heard so far?
Well, as the only American on the panel, and I am, don't let the accent fool you.
You might be the only European.
I don't
after
give a damn.
Brexit if Scotland.
So I get paid in the global reserve asset. I don't give a shit. So part of this, I'll put on my economist hat for a minute. So economists have this fun set of tools called game theory. It doesn't actually really do much, but sometimes it's fun. And one of them you can do is the battle of the sexes. And the battle of the sexes is, I want to eat Chinese. I want to go to the steakhouse. I want to eat at 8 o'clock. I want to eat at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's a coordination game. And part of what's going on is a coordination game, right? We all want the best outcome. We want to have dinner. We don't want to fall out, right? But we don't know how to get there. And then there's a mixed sort of like set of incentives going on, which makes this into a chicken game, like the two guys with the car driving towards each other. And both sets of incentives are in play at the European level. On the one hand, Britain is too big to fail. If Britain goes down, a large chunk of Europe gets hurt as well. That's unavoidable. So there's bargaining strength there, and you guys are absolutely right about that. But on the other hand, there is a weakness. And the weakness lies on the European side. It hasn't been going too well, has it? Right? Now, you've got a bunch of people who are incentivized to make sure that nobody else leaves. That's the game. It's Hotel California. You check in, you can't come out, right? Now, if the Brits leave and everything's okay, all bets are off. So you've got those two games going on simultaneously, and nobody really knows which game to play. So that's the first order one. The second one is, and this goes to the heart of it, and a couple of us have mentioned it, why do we think the euro's bust? I'll give you my version of this, right? Because I'm a Brit, so I have to think that, but I'll put that to one side. Here's the real one. Get a map of Europe. Draw a line right across, and you get what's called the olive oil butter line. Those who use butter, those who drink olive oil. And then you can also do this one. Catholics and Protestants, believe it or not, right? But it's also exporters versus large demand-dependent consumption economies. And what the euro has done is to put into a kind of straitjacket all of these very different economies with very different business cycles and say you will all be the same, particularly since the crisis. Now, there's a Eurozone surplus against the rest of the world of about 80 billion a month, and about 50 of that comes out of Germany. Now, we know they're efficient, but they're not that efficient. And the reason they can do this is because they didn't globalize their supply chains, they put them in Eastern Europe. High-skilled, low-cost, very good profits for companies investing in those areas. So Northern Europe, export Europe, is making out great. And you've got this artificially low exchange rate because of the euro, etc. But the problem is this, do the national accounts. If you're a country that kind of forgot to build fiscal institutions, which is what the EU currently looks like, if you're running an external surplus, somebody has to be running an internal deficit. But deficits are verboten because of the 2012 treaties. So what you're basically saying is, we're selling BMWs to the Brits, to the Chinese, to the Americans. We're making money. It's fantastic. How are you guys doing? Oh, by the way, that deficit you're running, it's keeping you afloat. You need to close that. You need to run a permanently contractionary macroeconomic policy so we can run a surplus against the rest of the world. Aye, that's sustainable. So that's your fault line. That's where it breaks. Now, it could be a referendum on the euro before, et cetera, but the long-run deal is set. So by the time that Britain figures out what it wants to do and what game it's playing, they might not be in a position to set the rules.
But let's look at the two scenarios. One is the euro does break up. In that case, Britain is in an incredibly strong position. Probably the international investors are all fleeing to a safe haven in London and from Europe, and it's carnage on the continent. The other scenario is, Merkel is re-elected. Macron somehow manages to get a working government, some modest reforms in France. Renzi wins in Italy. Suddenly,
have you seen the probabilities on each of those compounding?
Well, the first two aren't so bad, are they? Maybe Renzi, maybe, but I think probably I would bet on Renzi over the five-star movement at the moment. But then Europe actually says we've clung together pretty well. We've been growing. The economy is finally growing. Yeah,
this is the new Brussels narrative, and I short it. I don't believe it. The long-run real rate of interest for the globe since 1350 is 1.5% to 2%. That's it. Inflation is a weird anomaly, basically, of the 1970s. We're back to where we're meant to be. The little spike in inflation you're seeing just now is entirely down to devaluation effects and energy import effects. It's transient. It's not going to last. You've had chronic wage stagnation for 60% of the OECD's income distribution for 30 years. People are pissed. And if you just keep electing the mainstream with smaller and smaller and smaller majorities without actually giving a positive vision of how to change the game, then you're handing this to the populace. It's just a question of time. So let's say, take the French election. Let's say I'm wrong on Le Pen, and I'm happy to tell you why I think you might be unpleasantly surprised, because I'm not a supporter, but I think it can happen. Let's say we're wrong on this one. Let's say it's only 45% of the vote that she ends up with. That means nearly 1 in 2 French people are so disgusted with the system, they'll vote for them. Does anybody think that's a good outcome? So you can have that scenario, but I just don't think it goes anywhere.
Nick, what about you? On this point, I mean, obviously, if the euro collapses, Britain looks good. What if it doesn't collapse? I mean,
it's only a matter of time. I think that all the probabilities are too much. There is 28 countries working together which are so different, it doesn't work. And you're going to find it. It might not be France, it might not be Italy, it might not be Greece, but somewhere down the line, and it might be too late for our negotiations on Brexit, but my position is that I think somewhere in the next 2 and a bit years, and I think they may extend the negotiation a little bit so it's not, regimented, because if it's better for both parties, that is a soft Brexit rather than a terrible, hostile, hard Brexit. That's not good for Europe, it's not good for us. There has to be decent, fair negotiations, and I think over that 2-year period, somebody else will come to the table, and Europe will either need to reform in a major way, or we will get a much softer landing than we hoped. It may be a better deal. It might be the best of both parties. I think most people in this room that are British, that had the chance to vote last June, we all went to the polls, and I think most people in this room are sensible people. I'm not talking about the whole country, but most people in this room. And we went to the polls, and I think you would have taken the best of Europe and the best of the UK, and most of us would have been on the fence. I don't think most of us were extreme on either way. That's my belief. That's why I think it was a 52% vote.
Now, Jim, I think no one here has got any doubt that the Conservatives are going to win the election significantly. Does that make a big difference in how Britain may behave during the negotiations?
Well, it means that she, Mrs. May, can basically not worry about the troublesome backbenchers and factions, both pro-Brexit and pro-Remain within the Conservative Party. And I think it does, although the Europeans deny it, it does represent a united front from the British in terms of any negotiations or lack of negotiations. But I just want to get back to the point these two have made, and I agree with it, which basically Brexit is a sideshow to the big problems in Europe. And, in the next 2 years, there will be some event, we don't know what it is, but I could basically forecast today that Greece will be out within 6 months, and probably Italy is the next one out of the Eurozone. And then Brexit will be the least of their worries. It really will be the least of their worries. And it may give us a chance to say, hey, we're not actually going to Brexit now because you don't have the euro. And actually, all the things, the ideals that we liked in the European Union are going to be restructured back into a new European Union. So I think if we have a very strong negotiating position at the moment, we'll be in a much stronger position when the whole, the S hits the F, basically. You know what I mean? Basically. So, yeah.
So, Howard, in terms of negotiations, again, do you take seriously this notion that Europe is going to collapse and therefore save Britain from what will otherwise be quite a hard negotiation?
I see it rather differently. I think that they're going to try and kick the can down the road, and because of that, Europe's weak. I think they'll do everything they possibly can to keep Italy in the euro, because the level of default of the Italian banking system would be immense. And they owe the money to the ECB. And who's deposited the money at the ECB? The Germans. So it's actually Germany's problem if Italy leaves, and they'll do everything in their power to keep Italy in. Merkel's played hardball so far, but at some point she's going to have to play economic reality. Greece, on the other hand, they've already written the debt down, so it's much, much smaller. So they'll kick the can down the road for as long as possible, and that's why we're in a strong position, because Europe will still be fundamentally fragile, and the last thing you want if you're in a fragile situation is an economic shock. So it's all very well saying, oh, I'll play chicken, but it's bloody disaster for them if they played chicken
in the wrong team.
and there's a shock and Italy leave, oh, that's brilliant, brilliant. And they lose hundreds of billions of money that they deposited at the ECB? I don't think so. So all this talk about they're in a strong position, we're in a weak position, in my view is nonsense. The big exposure we had was the uncertainty post that referendum vote, because it was a massive change which people hadn't necessarily predicted or expected. And most of the people who were against Brexit, pro-Remain, predicted a major downward movement in our GDP in short order. So that's George Osborne, that's George Soros, that's the IMF,
Bank of England.
that's Jamie Dimon. All the people, they said, oh, we're going to fall off the edge of a cliff. Now we haven't fallen off an edge of a cliff, they're suddenly saying, well, I never really meant immediately, I actually meant, later. Well, actually, we're not going to fall off an edge of a cliff because we've got a mechanism called an exchange rate to adjust.
Exactly.
Well, some might say a 20% fall in the pound was falling off a cliff.
Well, I don't think so, because, we've come down from 2 to the pound to 145 or 150 before the Brexit vote since the financial crisis. And I didn't hear any of the intellectual elite saying, oh, that's terrible, the pound's fallen from 1.2 to 145, we've got less buying power, my loaf of bread in Sainsbury's is going to cost more money. They said, oh, that's good, our exports are going to be more competitive. Suddenly, a low exchange rate's a bad idea. I mean, frankly, the exchange rate will adjust to the economic circumstances and in the long term will match our long-term economic performance. The reason why our exchange rate is fundamentally lower is because we've got a big trade deficit. Yeah. We don't sell enough goods or services, and our exchange rate was overvalued. Our productivity is too low, it hasn't risen, and we need to find a way in Britain to raise our productivity to become, if you want the pound to go up, we need productivity to go up. The most important thing for Britain is deregulate. Use the opportunity to leave the EU to deregulate. Don't worry about trade. Don't worry about the deal. It will all take care of itself in time. We need to run our country better to be more competitive on a global basis and not have bureaucrats dictate to us day in, day out how to run our businesses. Final word on this, and the one point I totally endorse and agree with Jamie Dimon. He said on the lunch session yesterday, the big inhibitor to small businesses is regulation. And when I started in the mid-80s, I know there's a number of people here who are entrepreneurs. It was in the Thatcher days. We had a deregulated environment. It was easy as an entrepreneur to start your own business. Can you imagine how different it is today to do a startup compared to the mid-80s? And every time we get a new regulation, the government blames it on the EU. We never quite know whether it's an EU regulation or a government regulation, or whether we gold-plated it or we haven't gold-plated it. But one thing's for sure, if we leave the EU, we will leave the EU, they won't have an excuse. They'll be accountable. Every regulation they bring out, they'll be entirely accountable. So let's try and make Britain more competitive. Let's think about the long-term future of the country and not worry about a short-term negotiation.
Okay, now I want to bring the audience in. And I actually see one question.
I just want to follow up on a couple of points that my colleagues have highlighted, which I don't agree with. I certainly don't agree that the pound has lost 20% because...
10% now.
Well, from last year,
yep.
It's 20%. The reason why the pound's fallen was because it was Brexit was unexpected, and there's been a loss of confidence, some loss of confidence in what comes next for the UK. So that's why the pound has fallen. The second thing is that I don't agree with you that our position is as strong as you think it is, and here's the reasons why. For 6 years, Britain fought with the Eurozone to keep euro clearing in the UK. So that's housed under the LSE. We've got 3 European bourses under LSE, and they clear euro-denominated or Europe's deals, put it that way. And as I said earlier, that's 850 billion euros a day. So we are the back office or financial hub for the Eurozone. if that moves back to its natural home, which is Europe, as I said earlier, there are roughly about 100,000 jobs attached to that industry. So it can't be right when you say we have such a strong bargaining position, because financial services account for 40% of jobs in the UK. So I don't accept your argument. I think we're being I think we're being slightly naive about our bargaining position. What I do agree with, however, is that Europe's no great shakes. It's not a great story. There have been problems, but I do feel that Brexit is a wake-up call for Europe. I think that they will look at why the British public voted for Brexit, and they will take it seriously and they will reform. I don't accept that Italy's going to leave. The Eurozone had an opportunity for Greece to leave, and they never took that. Italy is a much bigger economy, so if they didn't allow Greece to leave, they're not going to allow Italy to leave, and they want to make the Eurozone a success. So I feel that I don't accept that. I think that the euro itself is a currency. As I said earlier, it's the second most popular traded currency, and actually it's a reserve currency for countries who do not wish to use the dollar, and there are significant number of countries in the EMEA region who use the euro as a reserve currency. So there are lots of plus points about the Eurozone, which in the heat of the moment we forget, and we shouldn't forget. Whether we accept it or not, they've allowed the UK to clear their financial transactions and to be the hub or the financial centre for Europe. When we leave the single market and we decide that we want to have control of our borders and take back our sovereignty, Europe have a right to say, well, look, if you decide that, we should be responsible for our own financial activities. It's only fair. But we should not be so naive to think that it will not impact us. There are over 100,000 jobs around London, and they will be affected.
Can I just ask one question? Stick up your hands. Who would rather live in London or Frankfurt? London? Frankfurt?
Well, I would rather live in London.
One guy at the
What's that got to do?
What's
that got to do with
That's not the
anything?
issue. That's not the issue.
We've got depth of talent. It goes back hundreds of years, the history, the infrastructure we have, the ecosystem.
Yeah, but Howard...
Yeah, but you can move to Dublin or Scotland if that pops out.
It's inconceivable that anywhere else in Europe can replicate what we have in London. At the edge, we'll move a few people. There'll be some kind of deal for access. Yes, a few jobs will be lost, but not that many. And London will still be the predominant financial centre within Europe.
And the jobs that are being lost, by the way, are through automation, not leakage to Europe.
We're not going to get into AI and...
No.
I wanted to bring in Peter Mandelson. I see him sitting at the front. Can I bring you in for a second, as you're here? And I think we have more of a Brexit panel than a Remain panel. And so maybe you could give us, would you be okay to give a couple of thoughts on how you see the negotiations playing out?
Well, you've got an entirely, predominantly pro-Brexit panel, but that's not the point. The point, I think, was very well articulated by Mr. Shaw.
Howard, yes.
Howard. Who has a perfectly respectable, perfectly interesting vision of a deregulated, tax haven, offshore Britain to the rest of Europe, which from his point of view, from his sort of commercial and economic point of view, I can completely understand. I understand why business people like Mr. Shaw.
I always worry when people call me Mr. Shaw. I'm waiting for the bullet.
Well, I don't know you. I don't know you, so I'm sort of being polite because I'm very English. But I don't believe that's what people voted for in Britain. They don't want to strip away sort of labour market protections or social standards or environmental standards. They don't want to be an offshore tax haven, Howard. And if there's any prospect over the next sort of year or so
Yes.
of that emerging from Brexit, I think you're going to have millions of people changing their minds and turning on that view. I always remember Rupert Murdoch explaining to somebody why he was so passionately anti the European Union. He said, look, from my business point of view, give me one government and I can bully it into doing what I want, but I can't take on 28. Now, from a business point of view, as you've well articulated it, you know, I can understand why you don't want to take on 28 member states in the European Union, because they will take a view of the public interest, which will not be the same as your business interest. And I think you will find that most people in Britain will, if given the choice, will align themselves and side with the public interest and not your personal business interest. The second point I'd make is this, arising from, again, what Howard said. He said the problem with Britain is that we don't sell enough goods and services. Now, the European single market is Britain's largest export market by far. It far exceeds anything, anywhere, any market, anywhere else in the world. And I'll come back to the rest of the world in a moment. And at the moment, the Brexit negotiation is heading towards not just our leaving the European Union, which people voted for, and that needs to be respected, but leaving the single market in its entirety and the customs union as well. And that means that the goods and services that we want to sell in our largest market by far is going to have new tariffs slapped on them, new customs barriers erected for goods, and in the case of services, that's sort of 80% of our UK economy, we are not going to be able to sell into that market unless we have equivalent regulatory standards and structures than those that you decry, because you think that regulation in itself is such a bad thing. And therefore, although there's not going to be some sort of huge overnight catastrophe befalling the British economy when we finally leave the European Union, you are, you know, the roof isn't going to cave in and whatever, but you are going to find a slow, steady, incremental loss by British exporters of their position in the single market, our biggest export market. You're going to find those international companies that located in Britain in order to trade tariff and customs free into the single market, probably having over time to scale down their production and relocate it within the single market because they don't want to face those tariff and customs barriers. And in the case of those who provide services, they're going to have to, where they face regulatory standards and requirements they have to comply with, they're going to, in many cases, relocate elsewhere into the single market so that they're with their regulators and not outside their purview. And all this is going to have consequences which, as I say, we're not going to see overnight. We're going to see over the next decade and two. And it's not, frankly, the living standards of people like you who are going to be affected. It's much, much poorer people who rely, you know, on trade, on jobs, on manufacturing jobs in the West Midlands, or where my constituency used to be in the north of England, where Nissan is, where Nissan in time is going to have to say, God, we love Britain, we've had a fantastic investment here, we have the most productive factory in Europe in the northeast of England, but we just can't take on those tariffs, I'm afraid. Our margins are not big enough, you know, to keep expanding and keep investing in our factory in the northeast. And very regrettably, therefore, we're going to have to scale down the northeast and scale up those factories which are elsewhere. And that will not affect you, Howard, one jot. Not
I have to
one,
answer this.
Not
I have to
one.
answer this.
Of course you will.
Yeah, I have
It
to
won't
answer
affect you one
Well, can I
jot.
turn
But
this
how
around?
about thinking about the rest of the British people?
Let me turn this around. How about you political elite, the political elite,
Experts.
let me think,
Experts.
well, I was also educated, Peter. So please, the political elite in London who support Labour all thought that staying in the EU is a wonderful thing. Your own voters in the areas that you're talking about, let me finish. I listened to you for 5 minutes, so let me finish, please. Your own voters in the regions in the Midlands and the North voted out. And why? Instinctively. The biggest reason, we both know, is because of uncontrolled immigration. Now, your political elite might say that that was because of racism. I don't believe that for a minute. The reality is that uncontrolled immigration in the UK that the Labour government actually allowed under Tony Blair from Eastern Europe allowed people, as Jim said earlier, to get the best of all worlds. They got jobs, they came to work, but they get free access to healthcare, to schools, to welfare payments, and I've got to answer this.
No, but you are answering. But I want to make sure that we stick to.
Well, I've got to answer. I've got to say that.
Can I answer?
Wait a minute.
No, because you have
Order.
got to let me.
Order.
No, because this is exactly what this is
Come on,
about.
I can't.
It's
Order,
about
Mr. Speaker.
immigration.
Wait.
It's about immigration. And he's absolutely put
Your
his
supporters.
finger on the nub of the issue.
Because-
it's not to do with economics.
Okay,
It's to do with the
Peter.
I'm
politics
losing
of
control of the
immigration.
audience.
No, Peter. It's all about economics because the GDP per capita has not been rising because
Howard, can I just ask you?
they've been
I need
having.
to ask you one question.
Yeah,
before-
please.
So the first thing the European Union is putting on the table is
Yes.
guaranteeing the rights of immigrants in Britain,
Yes.
including to be able to
Come on,
bring
let
in
me
their
answer.
families and so forth.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that's going to be? I mean, are we actually going to have any policies put in place that will actually, put up walls and keep people out?
You can be bloody sure that anybody who was in the UK before the vote will continue to be afforded all the rights that they had before the vote.
Including
My
become
guess-
citizens and bring in.
Yeah, my guess is as part of the negotiation that anybody who comes in up until the point we formally leave will have those same rights, but it probably depends on A, the negotiation, and B, the numbers. The point I was going to make is that the GDP per capita has not been rising and standard of livings have not been rising because of free access to a wonderful welfare system. Why are people queuing up in Calais to come to the UK? Because they're getting a better deal.
Okay,
And
I'm going to ask.
so that's the first point. The second
I need
point.
to get the rest of the panel.
Okay, but the
time is almost out.
final point is that if you, Peter, want Britain to prosper, businesses have to prosper on a global basis. What we don't want to do is go backwards and be stuck in a cartel, an uncompetitive, over-regulated, bureaucratic system, which we all know, if you cast your mind in 10, 20, 30 years, how many people here really think that we're going to have the same growth rate in Europe as we've got in, say, Asia? We've got to think about how to compete on a global basis.
Okay, I want to
not
bring
on
the
a
rest of the panel,
narrow-minded
the rest of the
defensive
panel into this interesting conversation. Mark, anything you want to react to, and is Scotland?
There's so much.
Well, you're a Scot, I
I am a Scot.
Is Scotland going to
so
where's Scotland going to be in 5 years?
Well,
time?
you know, if the rest of the UK had voted to remain, the Scots would have voted out because we're just bloody-minded contrarians. I mean, that's a large part of it. Again, no, the Scots don't really read. I was there recently and I was talking to them about, what do you want to do? I mean, if you really want to be independent, then you kind of need things like, having a currency. That's a good one, because then you can devalue and things like that. And, they look at you like, well, we just need to be independent. And like, you don't really have a clue what you're talking about. No, we don't. So I don't see that one going anywhere very fast, basically. That one's not going to go.
What about the argument between poverty and
just one comment on this,
deregulation
so time's running out. Growth rates across the developing world are falling everywhere. I mean, it doesn't matter what your regulatory regime is. Migrants in Cali, I mean, you know, if you've had a look at the French welfare system and you look at the British welfare system, if you're moving to Britain from welfare benefits from France, you've got rocks in your head. It's way better in France. So that one doesn't seem to make sense to me. But the bigger point is on growth. We're all getting old. Right? Your average Italian's 43.1 years old. Your average European's about 42.7. They save too much. So basically, you have over-saving in already rich countries. The rate of interest has declined to its sort of long-term historic mean. There's no inflation anywhere. Everybody's out looking longer and longer out in the curve for the hunt for yield because we think we can get some kind of regression back to 2005 when things were awesome, and that's not happening. And we live in this world, and basically everybody who's old and developed is dealing with lots of old people and low growth as a consequence. Not just to blame it on old people, but it's part of it. And you know, we talk so much about tech and things like this because that's the thing that's going to change everything. Well, for most of us, a technological change is yet another app on your phone to annoy you. So I'm sort of a little bit skeptical of this. So yes, it's great that we can do things, and I don't think Britain's going to blow up, the roof isn't going to fall in, et cetera, et cetera. But really, the growth stuff, that's huge, and it's huge everywhere. The US is in the same boat.
Nick, besides responding to what was said over there, if you want to, I mean,
I'll stay out of that fight.
okay, so Britain, there's a view that having survived the first few months after Brexit quite well, perhaps because of the Bank of England's intervention, and if we ignore the pound falling by 20%, that now the British economy is beginning to show signs of weakness, inflation starting to tick up, growth is slowing down. Maybe foreign investors aren't so keen on putting their money into Britain. What are you seeing? Does that?
No, I think.
How does the negotiations and how they play out and the day-to-day drama, is that going to affect
Well, on a real estate,
when to invest in Britain again?
in a real estate play, central London will always be an amazing place to invest. I think the investors, I think it's once in a generation for Asian investors, American investors with a currency play to come in and buy property relatively cheap. But if you're buying it for the long term, I think you'll do even medium term, you'll do very, very well. Currency, I don't believe the currency will be here at this rate in 5 years' time. I think
a lot stronger?
I think it'll be stronger. And, you know, if Theresa gets a decent majority, then hopefully she might change some of the stamp duty things which are holding back the property market.
Jim?
Okay, well, we are leaving the European Union, and while that might be a matter of regret in some ways, it's going to happen. So the issue is, how do we leave in the best possible way? Forget about the negotiations. I think the best thing that we can do is to maintain open borders to people, subject to the caveat I mentioned earlier, and open trade.
So you and Graham are completely at odds over the immigration?
I am with him, and it's a rare disagreement that we have on that. But I want to make a point on the British pound. Janet said that it's fallen by 20%. Actually, it's recovered 10% of that 20% fall, and it's now down about 10% on a trade-weighted basis. And the reason is because Britain is in a unique economic situation around the world. It's the biggest creditor nation in the world. And so when the pound falls, the value of the incoming profits, dividends, and other income streams from our foreign investments goes up in pound terms. And that's why the current account deficit since the date of Brexit has fallen by 2/3. It's the automatic adjustment of having our own currency. And I think that that's something very important to consider. The second thing is that the government has been undertaking austerity in a kind of stealth mode, and our public finances are actually getting better. The situation in the UK is not very bad in the international context. It's an okay situation. And of course, we are growing at 2% a year, which is higher for the 7th year in a row than any other major European economy. So I'm not too pessimistic about the outlook for the UK. And I do agree with Nick that the pound will be significantly higher when we meet again in 5 years' time.
Janet, last word to you.
I think long term, the UK, if it has a hard Brexit, if Theresa May leaves without any kind of deal, then I can see that the UK long term will be on a downward decline. I don't think she'll be able to do that. I think that when reality hits home with potential job losses, and there will be some level of discontent in the UK, because I think Peter, who's now gone, did mention that the people who make up the majority in the UK who are on either low income or middle income, they will start to feel the effects of high inflation, which is already creeping in. It's currently at 2.3%. It's up almost 2% based on last year.
And it's 2.8% in Germany, by the way.
2.3%. Yeah, but last year, our inflation, this time last year, our inflation was 0.0%.
And so was theirs.
But
So,
we have voted for Brexit.
It's not a British phenomenon. It's a rising inflation around the world due to misallocation of capital by central
Our
banks.
inflation is due to the fact that we are paying more for our goods and services because of the depreciation of sterling.
Well, we can argue about that.
Sorry, Mr. Shaw, Howard, would you like a final word?
I just note Peter Mandelson's left the room.
So I want to turn lastly back to you've heard a variety of opinions from the panel and the audience. Who thinks Brexit is going to play out well for Britain now, regardless of what you think about voting? It'll be good for Britain, and who thinks it's going to be bad for Britain? So I think that's I think actually you guys have turned them against Brexit even more. So fantastic job by our panel, and thank you very, very much for.